Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. President Harry Truman, addressing the final plenary session of the Preparatory Conference of the United Nations, made two statements that still hold true today. First, he said, we must set up an effective agency for constant interchange of thought and ideas, for there lies the road to a better and more tolerant understanding among nations and among peoples. He went on to warn with prescience that, and I quote, the forces of reaction and tyranny all over the world will try to keep the United Nations from remaining unified. Prime Minister Peter Fraser would have been in the audience. He signed the Charter of the United Nations just 2 years after the founding of the organisation we're celebrating today. Multilateralism, ever since, has been a pillar of our foreign policy, and with some shifts of emphasis, generally with bipartisan support. Our multilateral diplomats over the decades have made a creative and respected contribution to management of the global commons and to weaving the fabric of international law. But we meet now at a time when that multilateral system, the rules-based order we've all grown up with, is questioned, challenged, even undermined. We've heard the question asked this morning, have we come to the end of the golden age of multilateralism? Well, we've got another impressive panel for you this afternoon for this session. First, former Ambassador and now High Court Judge Gerard van Bohemen. New Zealand has had 3 full terms on the Security Council of the United Nations, and Gerard has been involved in 2 of those. We have another multilateral master, Bill Mansfield, former diplomat, former head of Department of Conservation. Bill will talk about some of the areas of the international rules-based system of most direct relevance to New Zealand, the law of the sea, management of fisheries, and the Antarctic. And finally, still at the cutting edge, we have Deputy Secretary Bernadette Cavanagh, responsible for multilateral and legal affairs. So, Gerard, over to you.
Thank you, Rosemary. Kia ora tātou, everybody. I want to first say how pleased I am to be on this panel with Rosemary, Bill and Bernadette. They're 3 people I've had an awful lot to do with in my career. I want to say particularly Bill was my first boss when I first joined the legal division, and he and my careers have continued to intersect over the next 40 years, which I've been extremely pleased about. The 2 other people I just want to pay tribute to as well, Chris Beebe, who was my mentor when he was ambassador in exile from Tehran and became a good friend, and Bryce Harland, who in his own very special way opened me to the wisdoms of diplomacy beyond the legal, and so they had a great influence on my career. It's well known that New Zealand was an early enthusiast for the United Nations. As been referred to today, our then Prime Minister Peter Fraser was an active participant in the final round of negotiations in San Francisco. Subsequent Labour ministers, and somewhat surprisingly even Mr McCulley, delighted in burnishing New Zealand's Fraser-led objections to the veto. They, and I expect most of you, were not aware of the memorandum that Dick Martin wrote from New York in 1983 on how the veto has kept the UN alive and therefore has been in New Zealand's long-term interests. Dick's memorandum did not elicit any response from Wellington, at least none that he shared with me. I thought at the time, and continue to think, there is something in its proposition that without the veto, the United States and perhaps Russia would have walked away from the UN many years ago. But I also think that the veto, and indeed the consensus rule, as Richard Noddard referred to today in the WTO, are fundamental weaknesses in the governance arrangements of international bodies. I also think, however, we're stuck with the veto. As a founding member of the United Nations, with English as our first, and in many cases, often our only language, and as a member of the Inner Wartime Alliance, New Zealand has had something of a charmed life at the United Nations. Having been there from the start, we are presumed to have good relationships with the United States, the United Kingdom, and the other major industrialised powers. We've had stable and responsible governments. We are presumed to be more attuned than many to the developing country perspectives and to have principled and independent views. Our representatives are reliably brave and smart and reasonable. All of these things have given us an influence that belies our population size and our geographical distance from the rest of the world. On the other hand, our reputation for espousing principled positions has also come back to bite us on occasion, sometimes quite painfully, when others see us falling short of standards they came to expect from us. The most searing episode in my experience was when we were beaten comprehensively in our bid for election to the Security Council in 1982, when Africa chose to withdraw support because of our continued sporting contacts with apartheid South Africa. Tim Francis called it a kick in the guts. It was a kick we should have seen coming. However, such episodes are usually quickly forgotten. The shellacking we received in the Security Council vote faded from memory within months. Within 2 years, New Zealand was on the centre stage with the arrival of David Lange and the buzz caused by the espousal of a nuclear-free New Zealand and the attendant standoff with the US over ship visits. Lange's visit to New York in 1985 coincided with the celebration of the UN's 40th anniversary, which attracted a level of interest probably unequalled in subsequent years until it's this year's visit of Jacinda Ardern and baby Nev. While these moments of international celebrity have been high points, the development of New Zealand's reputation as an independent player on the international scene has had a long arc, as you've heard today, starting with Fraser being given a big push with the Kirk-Rowling government, motivated by a need to diversify our interests with the UK's entry into the European community, given a further boost over the break with the US over ship visits, and reinforced, as we heard this morning, by the adoption of a bipartisan position on nuclear issues under the Bolger government. Since then, all governments have stated their commitment to New Zealand having an independent foreign policy. Thus it was that during our Security Council term in 93-94, we were expected by the then national government to be an independent voice on the Council, even if we caused heartburn to our friends in Washington, London and Paris. Whether going on the Council is a net positive for New Zealand always excites debate. The global realists say it's not worth the powder and shot or the risks of falling foul of major players. As for powder and shot, Simon Draper showed last time you can run a highly successful campaign by clever refocusing of existing resources. And I've always thought the risks overblown and outweighed by the benefits of greater profile and influence. I also subscribe to the view that taking a turn on the Council is an incidence of UN membership that should be embraced. Our term in 93-94 coincided with the post-Cold War optimism, that brief period that followed the fall of the Berlin Wall and the opening up of Eastern Europe, when some hoped the United Nations might finally be able to deliver on the promise of the United Nations Charter. There was a period from May 1990 to 31 December 1994 when only 2 vetoes were cast, both by Russia and more out of pique and frustration than any fundamental problem with the issues at stake. That period was probably the most promising time we had ever had on the Security Council. The permanent members' commitment to avoiding vetoes meant they had to work together to ensure they had 9 positive votes in order to pass any resolution they wanted passed, or 7 abstentions if they wanted to stop something they didn't want passed. The big issue of the time was the war in the Balkans, which became more vicious over our term. Things got worse after we left the Council before they became better. And that was largely the result of NATO taking matters into its own hands as Russia became increasingly defensive of Serbian interests. New Zealand played a significant part on the Council's discussions over the Balkans because of the strength of the interventions by Colin Keating and John McKinnon, and because New Zealand's words were reinforced on the ground by the contributions we were making to UNPROFOR, the UN force. One of my disappointments of our last term was that we were not able to match our words at that time with actions on the ground, largely, I have to say, as a result of ministerial timidity. The other big issues of the 93-94 term were Somalia, where post-Cold War aspirations for nation building ran into the realities of internal factionalism and poverty, deep religious and cultural divides. And Rwanda, which paid the price for the West's war weariness over Somalia and reluctance to take on the troubles of a small and strategically insignificant African state. While Rwanda got the headlines, we also played a serious, if much less public, role in slowing down the winding up of the UN operation in Somalia. In that, Colin and I worked closely with Kofi Annan's office, which was deeply worried at what would happen if the United States suddenly decamped, as seemed likely in the aftermath of Black Hawk Down. But it was Rwanda that defined our term, and for which we were most remembered, as was apparent when we campaigned for election in 2014. Colin's courage in standing up to the pressures from Boutros Ghali and the permanent members to downsize a peacekeeping operation in the face of genocide had a lasting impact that continues to resonate 20 years later. It required real courage in Wellington and in New York to sustain that effort over the difficult weeks of our presidency in April 1994, when Belgium, France, and the United States wanted the UN out, albeit for very different reasons. The Council in 2015-16 was a rather different place from 93-94. The agenda was bigger, the programme of work much more structured, and the Council a lot busier in a meetings-held sense. As a consequence, delegations were larger and roles within delegations more defined. The role of the ambassador, I felt, had become stylised and attenuated to the point that few ambassadors knew the details of the resolutions and presidential statements they were adopting in the formal chamber. One of my aims in the 20 months I had on the Council was to break down that formalised system and to force some real conversations within the group of permanent representatives. The larger aim was to open up space for New Zealand to be influential in the policy discussions on the major issues on the Council's agenda, so we were not simply recipients of positions worked out in Washington and the other P5 capitals. However, it was the state of global politics that most constrained our ability to do things, especially on the major issues. It was a fractious time. 4 vetoes were cast during our term, 2 during our presidency in July 2015. Fractiousness increased as efforts to broker a peace deal in Syria, founded in the face of Syrian government intransigence, bolstered by the use of chemical weapons and Russia's military intervention. The crisis in Yemen got progressively worse as the Saudis and UAE doubled down on their efforts to defeat the Houthi and the alleged Iranian backers. And North Korea ratcheted up its efforts in pursuit of a nuclear missile capability. In Africa, the civil war in Libya deepened. Islamic fighters targeted the UN operation in Mali. South Sudan's leaders prioritised their internal struggle for power over the needs of their people, and the Moroccans punished the UN mission in Western Sahara for Secretary-General Ban's uncharacteristically intemperate but honest remarks about the plight of Sahrawi refugees. Sadly, there were few good stories in our term. The biggest one was the Iran nuclear deal, negotiated outside the Council and presented for adoption as an untouchable package. So too was the Colombia peace deal. Both later ran into trouble. For the record, we did put the security concerns of small island developing states on the Council's agenda. We secured 2 resolutions on the humanitarian situation in Syria, and an even more significant resolution on the protection of humanitarian actors in situations of armed conflict, and I want to pay tribute to Carolyn Schwalger for all 3 of those resolutions. We changed the nature of the conversations within the Council, and we established a mechanism to assure ambassadors at least talk to each other at the beginning of every month about what the Council is going to be doing. We also pushed the elected members to work together to try to harness the power of the temporary 10 as a constraint on that of the permanent 5. We also tried, without success, to get a resolution to reignite the Middle East peace process, to stop the bombing of Aleppo, and the Council's statement supporting the UN mission in Western Sahara. And not as a spare time job, we tried to get Helen Clark elected as Secretary General of the United Nations. It's likely history will remember us most for the resolution on the Middle East adopted on 23 December 2016. It was a resolution that came our way rather than one we went looking for. but was one we could hardly refuse to endorse given our promotion of our own Middle East resolution and the fact that it reflected largely established New Zealand policy. I know there were domestic political ructions, but I am proud that New Zealand not only agreed we should support the Egyptian-led resolution, but unprompted by New York, instructed us to co-sponsor it. None of us could have predicted what would happen next. That President-elect Trump would get involved, that President Sisi would instruct the Egyptian delegation to withdraw its own resolution, that the Russian delegation would run procedural interference on the resolution, and that between them Jared Kushner, Michael Flynn, the National Security Advisor-elect, and Prime Minister Netanyahu would lobby every council member to try to pull support for the resolution. They did not succeed, and it would have been very bad for the United Nations if they had. In hindsight, I came to realise that all of that activity, which we had seen as final scenes in our departing the Security Council, was actually presaging a new and more difficult world order that the international community now confronts. The UN and multilateralism were having problems before the arrival of President Trump, but there is no doubt that the new approach in Washington is making the problems much bigger. Whether this is a 4 or 8 year aberration, or is in fact a cementing of a trend in US disengagement that has been underway since President Reagan, there's no avoiding the reality that we now confront a serious challenge to the internationalist, multilateralist, cooperationalist approach that has underpinned New Zealand foreign policy since the Second World War. But it is a challenge we have to meet. Like many other small countries, we can't secure our future by a policy of border walls and the exercise of power. Nor can we turn back the clock to align with a larger friend, whether it's a exited once Great Britain or Australia. We need many friends. The coming increasingly borderless world requires greater, not less, cooperation. We need friends and more rules so we can increase the chances of weathering the turbulence that we all seem to feel lies ahead. Right now, my view, there is zero chance of institutional reform of the United Nations, and I expect the same is true of most other international bodies. So grand schemes of Security Council reform are for another day. Our focus should be on using what we have to as much effect as we can and on encouraging others to do the same. That was the approach we took during our last term on the Council. Don't ask for permission, don't ask to change the rules, just do things until you find you can't. And work hard to take others with you, because there is strength and comfort in numbers, especially when the going gets rough. Thank you.
Thank you, Gerard, for a masterly compression of a huge amount of experience and geostrategic change into a short time. Now we leave the highly pressured atmosphere of the Security Council and go to matters practical. Bill, please.
Thanks, Rosemary. Kia ora tātou. Well, my starting point is that pretty obvious one, that for most of its history, the main feature that's distinguished New Zealand from other countries is its relative isolation at the bottom of the world, surrounded by enormous oceans. Now, advances in communications have changed that sense of isolation dramatically, but they haven't changed the fact that we are surrounded by ocean. We're the opposite of a landlocked state. We're ocean-locked. Our trade is dependent on our ability to ship our goods across the oceans, and our tourism industries dependent on the ability of aircraft to fly across them. And in resource terms, we assert a right to one of the largest EEZs in the world and to a very broad continental shelf that goes out beyond the zone in several areas. Yet we take this state of affairs for granted, and in terms of the attention we devote to it, we seem to assume it's the natural order of things and will continue indefinitely into the future. And a glance at the map of the world to our south shows a continent larger than Australia or Europe, closer to us than Asia, but to which, in comparison with Asia, we give little attention. Yet, in strategic security terms alone, we have a clear interest in the peace and stability of this continent and the seas around it. And given what we know today about the critical importance of Antarctica and the Southern Ocean in relation to climate and the productivity of the world's oceans, the case for this area and its rules being a major focus for our attention seems obvious. But again, we seem to take the current situation for granted and assume it's unlikely to change. Now, our seemingly relaxed approach to the oceans around us and to Antarctica is based on two major international treaty regimes: the Law of the Sea Convention of 1982, or UNCLOS, and the Antarctic Treaty of 1959. We were closely involved in the negotiations that established these two framework regimes, and we continue to participate in the ongoing work under both to address new issues. But I would suggest there is little public understanding today of the tensions and potential conflict that led to their negotiation, or of the delicate balances and compromises that were necessary to reach agreement, or of the serious implications for New Zealand if pressures arising from new issues are not able to be successfully managed and lead to their unravelling. The origins of UNCLOS lay in the disintegration last century of the 300-year-old concept of freedom of the high seas beyond a cannon shot length off the coast. It took 3 UN conferences, the third of which lasted more than a decade, to produce what was termed by its president a constitution for the oceans. We played an active role in all three, and MFAT was the lead agency for the policy formation and in the negotiations. The outcome for New Zealand and the Pacific Islands could hardly have been better. The EEZ concept was accepted. We won the controversial right for it to be applicable to small islands, and the balance of coastal state rights and obligations in international straits, in territorial seas, and in the EEZs protected our international trading interests. Now, I don't have time to talk about the extensive cooperative work we did with the Pacific Islands. We formed the Oceania Group, which worked together over 10 years to battle and gets acceptance of the idea that open ocean islands are a very different case from situations of a continent with somebody else's offshore island just off your coast. But to return to my theme, the balancing of the interests that enabled the adoption of the convention was extremely complex. It's unlikely it could ever be replicated, or that any attempted renegotiation would produce a result as favourable for us or as effective in securing international peace and security. As to Antarctica, again, it was concern about risks to international peace and security that led to the negotiation of that treaty. The relevant history is set out in the first of Malcolm Templeton's 2 great books on New Zealand's Antarctic policy, including as an indication of its strategic importance that early in the Second World War, German raiding vessels based in the Kerguelen Islands, quote, disrupted Allied shipping, captured a large proportion of the Norwegian whaling fleet, and mined Australian and New Zealand ports, unquote. Then, of course, in the late 40s, the Americans became increasingly concerned about the possibility of open confrontation between Britain and Argentina or Chile in the area of their disputed overlapping claims. And it was also realised that Cold War tensions could spill over into Antarctica. It's the treaty that has secured peace and stability in Antarctica for nearly 60 years. It hinges on Article 4 on territorial claims. That article doesn't solve the fundamental disagreement over sovereignty, but it makes unnecessary the kind of action and reaction in relation to these territorial disputes that would carry a high risk of conflict. It was an extraordinarily creative solution back in 1959, a problem that was intractable then, but I would suggest would be even more intractable today, given the greater levels of public interest in Antarctica, not least in claimant countries, and the greater accessibility of the continent. Now, resources weren't an issue, or an active issue in 1959, but within a decade, it was clear that a scramble for them could lead to a breakdown of the treaty. Why? Because claimant and non-claimant countries would give fundamentally different answers to the basic question of who has the right to exploit or prevent exploitation. We were the first treaty party publicly to draw attention to this problem and argue it had to be faced. The negotiations that eventuated were complex and difficult and absorbed a considerable amount of New Zealand's and especially MFAT's diplomatic efforts for many years, but they resulted in two major new instruments that put in place systems, including prohibitions, that dealt with the risk of conflict over resources. And I would note in passing that contrary to some public commentary, the prohibition on mineral resource activities is indefinite in duration. Now, inevitably, new issues continue to arise, but in my view anyway, the regime has a solid track record of facing and resolving them. The risk, as I see it, is that some may forget that solutions to new issues, just like day-to-day management of activities on the ice, need to be based on the treaty and the Article 4 fix on sovereignty. A failure to remember this and the pre-treaty tensions would have the potential to jeopardise the treaty and our fundamental interest that our backdoor, our real backdoor, is peaceful and stable. Just go back to that. As to UNCLOS, the convention itself is not under threat, but again, a failure to remember the interconnected compromises in the convention could present risks in relation to new issues. In particular, I think we need to be aware that competition for diminishing stocks amongst an excessively large world fishing fleet could eventually lead to a weakening of international acceptance of very large EEZs like ours, unless they are demonstrably managed with a close eye to the long-term interests of the international community as well as to the interests of the relevant coastal state. Looking into the crystal ball, it's always possible that new weaponry may reduce the effectiveness of the maritime forces whose role and presence has in practice supported the balance of coastal and international maritime interests established in the convention. Climate change may open up new navigable trading routes, especially in the Arctic, which may raise new issues. And the redistribution of world power that seems currently to be underway may have implications for the practical application of the convention in some areas. But it seems to me more likely the effect of such developments will in general be confined to questions relating to the status of particular areas of land or sea and the entitlement to the associated rights. For trading reasons alone, it seems unlikely that any of the major powers would have an interest in a general weakening of the navigational rights established by UNCLOS. So to conclude, our geolocation means we have a stronger interest than most in proactively supporting these two regimes. They were certainly two of the greatest contributions to international peace and security last century, but for us in particular, their combined effect has been to secure the stability of our backdoor and our trading links to the rest of the world, while dramatically expanding our rights in respect of the oceans immediately around us. But the background situations that led to their negotiation were different. They were drafted at different times and have different parties. Unsurprisingly, therefore, there are areas of tension between them. So looking to the future, in my view, a priority for New Zealand and a key role for MFAT will be to ensure these tensions are managed successfully so as to ensure the continued contribution of both regimes to New Zealand's security and economic interests, as well as to international peace and security as a whole. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Bill. Great to be reminded of the legal framework that we come to regard as almost invisible. We take it so much for granted. Now, multilateral diplomacy is known for requiring a very high threshold of boredom and a deep well of patience, but impossible in today's world to imagine a 10-year conference to create something. Bernadette, tell us about the impossibilities of today's world.
Kia ora koutou katoa. In the program for this afternoon, I was listed as speaking about international environment negotiations. But as a typical multilateral diplomat, I immediately proposed an alternative. I found some previously agreed language and I wore everybody else down. So this afternoon, I'm going to take a slightly different approach. We've spent much of the day looking at the ministry's past. That's appropriate, it's the 75th anniversary. But I'd like to very briefly focus on some of the challenges we face or will face in the future and our current approach to multilateralism. I will start with a couple of observations which have been key themes throughout the day, and they won't come as any surprise. The first is the international rules-based system is under strain. Some would say there's nothing new to see here. Our predecessors in the ministry certainly talked about this, and I'm sure the generation before them said exactly the same. It's a live debate within the ministry as to whether what we are seeing now is qualitatively different. But whether this is the worst it has been is probably irrelevant. What is important is that many of the international institutions that were developed after the Second World War and which are fundamental to the international rules-based system are very much under pressure. The UN and the Security Council, as we've heard from Gerard, the World Trade Organization, as we heard this morning. I'd add to that list the International Criminal Court and the Human Rights Council. And while the actions of President Trump's administration are at the forefront of public discourse, system strain is both widespread and long-standing within the UN and other international organizations. The UN membership, and the UN membership, of course, is us, has struggled to deal with increasingly complex global challenges. For example, protracted conflicts such as that in Syria are putting enormous pressure on humanitarian agencies in the UN system, but more significantly, on the UN's credibility. Added to that, a more diverse range of countries are active multilaterally, at the same time as some of our traditional friends, such as the EU, are internally focused. The second point is that as a small country, New Zealand needs the international rules-based system. And as we have heard today, it has been a central tenet of our foreign policy. The Prime Minister summed up New Zealand's approach neatly at the UN in New York recently when she said, "Given the challenges we face today and how truly global they are in their nature and impact, the need for collective action and multilateralism has never been clearer." With that background, the obvious question is, so what is the ministry doing about it? Well, it's not easy, but we are trying. We're actively supporting the reform efforts of UN Secretary-General Guterres, who has launched wide-ranging reforms covering UN management systems, the development system, and peace and security. Across UN member states, there is a widespread agreement that reform is needed. For its own credibility, the UN needs it. But as soon as reform proposals touch on national interests, or even the employment of nationals, agreement evaporates. So one area we're actively exploring and working on is building cross-regional support for UN reform. And we're not seeking anything revolutionary, even simple things like letting the Secretary-General manage his own staff, for the UN having a single office in countries, and reducing the amount of time it takes to recruit staff. It currently sits at about 300 days. We're also thinking about how we might better utilize existing international institutions, such as the Commonwealth or the Pacific Islands Forum, to work together to champion rules. It's about working with others who share our goals to protect the system. Those shared goals were on display at the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting in London in April this year, where numerous leaders spoke in support of the international rules-based system. Our challenge is trying to turn that broad agreement into practical measures. We've taken some small steps in this way in Geneva, with the New Zealand team hosting meetings of Commonwealth countries to discuss ways in which to support the WTO. It's a new space for us. So a key goal is trying to build cross-regional support for the system. And as we heard from Richard Nodditch this morning, that has long been a New Zealand tactic, and we need it now just as much as before. Thinking creatively about partners or like-minded is also crucial. We need them to be wide-ranging and include countries in Latin America, Caribbean, Africa, and Asia. So what are we worrying about now? Well, climate change and environment issues are areas that capture much international attention and concern, and rightly so. I don't propose to rehearse the issues here. Suffice it to say that New Zealand's point of view, and being mindful of the fact that of some of our neighbours in the region are at the forefront of these issues, global action is required. Maintaining momentum with the Paris Agreement will be crucial, and at the next Conference of Parties in December in Poland, we need the international community to agree the Paris Rulebook, or the details of how the Paris Agreement will be implemented. Then there are a number of new challenges to the multilateral system that are technology-driven. It's particularly the case in the security and disarmament spaces. We're having to work in areas we would not have, that would not have warranted much attention 75 years ago. Cyber issues is one that you'll all be familiar with. But now that New Zealand has a space program through the impressive efforts of Rocket Lab, we have had to become more fully involved in discussions on the peaceful uses of outer space. So the governance of space is an increasingly important issue for us. There are also some other emerging issues which frankly we're only just starting to become aware of, let alone grapple with. And they are as baffling as anything you will see in a sci-fi movie. There's artificial intelligence, which we know something of, but there's hypersonic weapons, which I'm told occupy a space between conventional and nuclear weapons, and about which I didn't even know their existence of a week ago. Lethal autonomous weapons systems such as killer robots, drones, and unmanned combat aerial vehicles. There are also developments in genetics and biotechnology, which promise much in terms of improving health outcomes on a large scale, but can also be used for less benign motives. The power and scope of the technologies themselves are difficult to comprehend, and their potential implications go beyond the disarmament and security spaces and into the international legal and human rights spaces. For all of these technology developments can be used by regimes or governments to increase the power of the state and to undermine fundamental human rights. And they all have transboundary implications. The reality is that technology has outpaced domestic and international law and regulations. And this all just serves to make the point that a multilateral approach will be just as important, and arguably more important, than it has been over the last 75 years. While the challenges facing the international rules-based system are new and different, the fundamentals of multilateral diplomacy and its requirements remain largely the same. As a foreign ministry, we continue to need to work with others, both onshore and offshore, to ensure we are appropriately positioned to play a part. And to gain access to those negotiations, our currency is still ideas. To be able to think creatively and wonder about what could be, not only what is. So acknowledging that this is an occasion to celebrate the Ministry's 75th anniversary, it's worth celebrating our history of creating excellent multilateral diplomats. There are many here in this room, not least the three sitting on the panel beside me. But there's three who aren't here who I do want to call out. There's Jan Beagle, a former MFAT staffer who's currently the UN Under-Secretary General for Management. It is probably one of the toughest and most thankless tasks in the UN. There's Joe Tyndall, our climate change ambassador, who is currently co-chair of the negotiations on the Paris Rulebook. And there's Del Higgy, our disarmament ambassador, who has been at the forefront of New Zealand's international disarmament and non-proliferation actions for many years. As we think about the challenges we and the world are facing, we need people like Jan, Joe, and Del. And I'm pleased to say that in the best trends of the ministry, there are excellent young diplomats to take up the baton on behalf of New Zealand. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bernadette. And I just want to add a personal note of thank you to two of the people who trained me, well, three actually. Priscilla Williams in the audience today, Terence O'Brien not able to be here, Bill, who was ahead of me. And I think as we close the session, because we must remain on time, just a tribute to Malcolm Templeton. He's been mentioned a number of times, but he would have to be one of the towering tupuna of our multilateral whānau. So here's to Malcolm. And thank you very much, panellists, for all of those insights.